All right, and we're back. Another week, another episode of the Victory Degree podcast. Today we are joined by Jacob Turner. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Nick, thanks for having me, man.
I'm excited. So a little bit about you. You're from St. Louis, Missouri. You were the 9th overall pick in the 2009 MLB draft by the Detroit Tigers. You spent 11 years, about 11 years in the league, played for Detroit, played for Miami, played for both Chicago teams, which is pretty cool. And now you are on to bigger and better things with wealth management and then helping athletes manage their money, their investments, their assets, all of that good stuff. Beyond your resume and some of the experiences that you've had, if you were hypothetically to run into someone on the street who didn't know who you were, didn't know anything about you, and they said, listen, I need 2 minutes. All I have is 2 minutes. Tell me who you are.
It's a good question. It's a good question for a couple of reasons, because I used to tell people like anything but what I actually was when I was a professional athlete. If somebody asked me what I did, I would come up with literally anything to tell them other than that I was a professional athlete, because I just didn't want to talk about it. I would tell them that I own a business and I help people get smarter with their money from a business standpoint. I would tell people that I have 4 kids that mean the world to me, and that me and my wife have been married for over 10 years now. We met in high school. So that would give them a better sense of who I am as a person, and also what I do on the business side as well.
So you said when you were a professional athlete, you didn't like telling people that you were a professional athlete. Why is that?
I think a few different reasons. One, when just like any job, right? Like professional sports is the greatest job in the world, but it's still a job. And it was something that I was doing every single day. And the last thing I really wanted to do when I was doing it every single day and under the stress of it, to be honest with you, was just talk about it more. So I would typically just avoid it. So then that way I wouldn't get a question about it. And then I think also a lot of times I'd be answering the same question that I'd answered 10 times previously. And I just didn't really want to go down that road. So I would come up with anything. I remember one time I told somebody that I was a construction worker, and then they asked me where I was doing construction at, and I told them basically the address of the stadium. And they were like, "Oh, isn't that where the XYZ team plays?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's where they play." So,
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I imagine all of the questions that you would get, as a player in the MLB. It's like, hey, what's it like being in the league? What's it like being popular? What's it like, going on these road trips with the team? So it sounds like a lot of those type of questions eventually just got way too repetitive, right?
yeah, and I think, look, like my career wasn't the guy that was on the front page of ESPN. It wasn't Patrick Mahomes going to 6 AFC championships and going to, whatever it is, 4 Super Bowls now. A lot of my career was struggles. And a lot of times when you're having those struggles and you're going through it, like I didn't want to constantly be talking about it. Or, you'd get the questions about like, well, what are you going to do next year to make it better? When are you going to go pro? It was just all kinds of questions that in the moment I'm like, I don't want to deal with these. So I'd rather just say something else.
Fair enough. Jacob, I want to take us back to the beginning of your baseball career, which might have started when you were young. And in looking through your profile on X, on Twitter, whatever you want to call it nowadays, a lot of your tweets and a lot of the stuff that you put out revolves around the things that your dad used to tell you when you were young. And so I want to bring up one thing that you posted. You said, I saw my dad, a business owner for 20 years, get pennies on the dollar for his business due to subpar advice / planning. Can you talk to me a little bit about the influence that your father had on your life, and kind of maybe some of the building blocks that you experienced early on that kind of set you up for the rest of your career?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was my hero. So, for people that don't follow me on Twitter, and I post this stuff online, but my dad passed away a few years ago from pancreatic cancer, and I'd share a lot of the stories and lessons I learned from him. And my biggest goal, and even as a dad now, is that my kids will look at me as how I looked at him. And look, my dad wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he instilled so many lessons in us. And, I think ultimately he taught us to work hard. He taught us to be honest. He taught us that our word means something in a world that I think oftentimes it doesn't anymore. So he taught us so many building blocks and foundational elements. I even remember when he got sick, he told me one day we were having a conversation. I was pretty upset just given what he was going through and the reality of the situation. He's like, Jacob, I've given you all the tools you need at this point. And I think that part was cool for me because it was true. Like he'd given me all the tools. It was up to me then to go out and make an impact in the world just like he did.
Yeah. How do you mentioned you have kids. I believe you have 4 kids of your own. I'm sure, as you said, you take a lot of stuff that your father taught you and you try to pass it on to them, whether it be hard work, whether it be persistence, whatever the case may be. Um, as someone who grew up playing sports from an early age, I quickly understood the importance of youth sports and just being involved with sports early on. I was reading a couple articles the other day. Looks like youth sports participation is down across the board. I think actually specifically for high school boys, it's the lowest it's ever been since 2007. And I'm sure high school girls is probably a similar story. So now when you look at your own kids, having been a youth sport athlete yourself, what what importance do you place on youth sports, and how do you try and project that onto your own children?
I think it's all about teaching your kids life lessons and teaching them through showing them and letting them live life
Mm.
to learn. And sports is one of the best teachers out there. And look, it doesn't mean that every kid has to play sports. My kids like sports and they play them, and I think it's great. And they're able to learn life lessons. My son had a hockey tournament this weekend, and they came in second place, and they didn't come in first, and he was disappointed that they didn't come in first. But that's just a life lesson that, like, sometimes you put it all on the table, and like it doesn't go the way that you exactly want it to go. So, it bums me out to hear that sports participation is down across the board. But frankly, it doesn't totally surprise me in the world that we're living in. In the world of screen time and video games and people being indoors and not being outside as much, I think that leads to probably less kids playing sports.
Yeah, like I said, as someone who grew up playing sports, it is sad to see. And to your point, a lot of it has to do with technology, right, and the screen time and all that. And I'm sure that's a topic that we can probably spend, a couple of hours on, really dissecting kind of, what's going on, and then also what you pointed out, the ramifications down the line, right? I mean, what kind of role is this going to play, when these kids, in high school, middle school, elementary school, when they grow up, what kind of ramifications will they have? We're kind of seeing that with COVID now, 2020 when everybody was home, we're kind of seeing the ramifications of that, right? And what impact that had in society. So, youth sports is another pillar of growing up. I feel like it teaches you so much. I'm a huge advocate for it, if you can't tell. But let's get back to you. So you're a baseball player. You start playing early on. Did you was it from the moment that you picked up a bat or a baseball, were you like, this is it? Like, I found it. This is my passion. This is what I'm going to do
Yeah.
for a career.
Yeah. Well, I think my answer should be my answer is important for everybody that was listening to the youth sports question, because one thing that bothers me about youth sports is like all these kids that are so focused on one thing, and they, the parents think they're going to be a professional athlete in that sport.
Mm.
Growing up, I loved ice hockey and I had liked baseball, but I didn't love baseball. And ice hockey was really the sport that I loved more than anything. I ended up having a somewhat severe injury going into high school with my knee, and at the same time was getting better at baseball. And essentially was like, I think I really want to focus on baseball. And, human nature is you want to focus on the things that you're really good at. I was getting better at baseball at the time. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, no, when I first started playing baseball, honestly, I played it because my older brother played it and I wanted to be like him. But it wasn't the sport that I had the most passion around at the very beginning. And I think it just goes to show that, sometimes over time people evolve into what they end up doing later in life.
So what was, as you were growing up playing baseball, you say you didn't have like the biggest passion for it. So what kept you motivated to keep getting better? Because I mean, baseball is a difficult sport, and ending up where you ended up, I don't think happened by accident. So what kind of kept that fire burning throughout the years?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, my dad coached the team, and my brother and I played on the same team. So I played up essentially every year of youth sports, and I always wanted to be better than him because that's just the way brothers are. And I think, look, my parents instilled a really solid work ethic and me and my two brothers. And I think that ultimately led us to the success that we've had both in baseball and in life. But in terms of like what kept me motivated, you know, I did like baseball growing up, and I'll never forget, like, we were such sports kids is what I would say. Like, we didn't have cable TV until we were like maybe 10 or 11 years old. But I remember when we got cable TV for the first time and we were able to turn on ESPN and watch Sports Center. It was like we either were watching Sports Center or we lived in a cul-de-sac and we used to play this game in the street with a tennis racket and a tennis ball. And we were kind of like playing a mock baseball game, so to speak, with me and my two brothers. So sports was always a huge part of our life. And, you know, I always felt like there was going to be something around it. I didn't know if it was going to be at the professional level or at the college level.
Yeah, the Sports Center top 10. I still remember the theme music. You know, staying up late as a kid. You know, trying to see who's who made the top 10. What's like the craziest play tonight. I mean, it's it's memories
Stuart
like
Scott.
that.
Oh yeah.
Stuart Scott. I mean, legend of the game. It's stuff like that you kind of think back on, right? Where in the moment might not seem like a big thing, but now you think back on it and you're like, wow, that was actually, you know, it was something small but yet so meaningful, right? Like something as you know, simple as, you know, Sports Center top 10.
Oh yeah. I mean, we watched Sports Center, PTI, which is on ESPN. I think it might still be on ESPN. Baseball Tonight, like you said, the Sports Center top 10. That was always a fan favorite to see what was going to be in that. And I mean, you see these guys that are on TV, and as a young kid, you're, you know, for lack of a better term, you're really idolizing them and looking up to them and wanting to be like them when you're practicing the sport you're playing.
Right. I have a couple questions about, I guess, the reality of being a professional baseball player, but we'll get to that later on. I want to continue down your journey. So you're in high school, you're playing baseball, you're 18 years old, you have an idea that you might get drafted into the MLB. Draft day, draft night comes along, and you do not want anybody sitting there with you watching the draft. Can you explain to us why that was?
Yeah, well, in baseball specifically, especially as a high school player, you really don't know what's going to happen. And a lot of the times it's not really dictated by your talent. It's dictated by a combination of talent and what you're willing to sign for. Because at the time, teams could essentially pay anything, but it's really not that much different than it is now, where a team really has to decide as a high school player, like, am I willing to meet whatever their quote unquote demands are to get this player to potentially sign? So although I knew going into the draft that my talent level probably dictated that I would get drafted in the first round or the top 30 picks, the amount of money that it was going to take for me to sign might have said, like, I don't know if I'll get drafted in those top 30 picks. And, you know, we talk about ESPN. I can remember watching, you know, the NFL draft, because the MLB draft, that was the very first year, was on TV. So it wasn't as publicized as it is today, but the NFL draft had been. And you always see those NFL guys that are at the draft and they're supposed to go in the top 5, and they're supposed to go in the top 10, they're supposed to go in the top 20, and whatever they are, they're falling out of those projections. And it feels like every camera's on them. And look, there wasn't cameras in our house, but it would have felt like that to me if we would have had a bunch of people over. So I just wanted to have an experience with just the people that were closest to me, my brothers and my mom and dad.
Yeah. I remember, I think you were on a different podcast and you had mentioned that story, and it's weird because, to your point, you know, we see a lot of these you know, draft night you know, experiences, and there's players and they're surrounded by their family, and everyone's excited if they go high, but then the camera pans over to someone who might be falling in the draft, and, you know, everyone's kind of disappointed and looking down, and I would always try to imagine like what it would be like to be in that position, kind of that feeling of disappointment. I just can't imagine being there and being like, oh man, like, you know, nobody wants me. Like what, like, what do I do now? Like,
Yeah.
nobody wants to draft me.
Yeah. I mean, it's really weird, right? Like I think it's a good life lesson of like expectations, because if you would have asked any of those guys in any of those rooms that were getting drafted in the first round of the NFL draft, you would have asked Aaron Rodgers, right? Aaron Rodgers is poster child for this. Supposed to go top 5, ends up falling to the back half of the first round. But if you would ask Aaron Rodgers as a kid, like, if you become a first round pick, would that be a successful, you know, football career? And he probably would have said, yeah. But the expectation before he went into that draft room was he's going to get drafted in the top 10. So then when he gets drafted, you know, later in the first round, it's this big disappointment. When in reality, like, it's still an amazing accomplishment. So it's a total whirlwind of emotions. And I always feel for the guys when I'm watching the draft, and it's really interesting to watch the draft of any sports league now because I look at things that probably nobody else looks at in terms of like who's around them, how are they reacting to this, how does the player react, who does he hug first, all those things that to me show little insights into that player.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jacob, you get drafted ninth overall. So I'm sure at the time you were excited. You're like, all right, I'm going to Detroit. This is the start of my MLB career, straight out of high school, by the way. Your contract at the time was, and I believe still to this day is one of the largest contracts for a high school draftee. I believe $5.5 million was your first contract. And I think you wrote about this somewhere where the first check that hit your bank account was $1.2 million, somewhere in there. Being 18 years old, 19 years old, and seeing that check hit your bank account, what was that like? What emotions were you feeling in that moment?
The way that I describe it is like it changed everything, but it changed nothing. And what I mean by that
Mm.
is, look, the world moves around money and currency and the ability to be able to do things and afford things. So I don't want to discount the value of what dollars bring. But at the same time, I didn't start playing baseball to earn a bunch of money doing it. I started playing baseball because I really enjoyed it and I was good at it. And for me, it was never about the money, and nothing ever changed when I got the money, right? I didn't go out and I didn't buy the fancy car. I think the most expensive thing I bought was like a computer. So it changed everything because the reality is like I went from a situation where I had maybe a couple $100 in my bank account to having millions of dollars overnight. And I don't want to discredit that. But at the same time, it really didn't change all that much because I didn't do anything really different in my lifestyle. I was still the same person. And I think money is an amplifier of who you are. And it doesn't change who you are, but it just amplifies who you really are at your core.
So you say you need to go out and buy the fancy stuff, and we'll get into it a little bit when we talk about moment wealth and everything that you have going on there. But with a lot of athletes, it seems like that is one of the first things that they go and do. And so, from your perspective and what you've seen working with athletes, kind of just being a part of this ecosystem, is that the number one mistake that athletes make when they first receive this large sum of money?
I wouldn't say it's a number one mistake. And I wouldn't say it's a mistake at all to go out and spend money when you first get it
Mm.
because look, you've worked really, really hard to get to the point you're at. Oftentimes, what people don't realize is even for a high school kid, it's probably been 5 to 6 dedicated years of them really focusing and honing in on the fact that like they could become a professional baseball player. Because, if you get drafted at 18, realistically, by the time you're kind of 13, 14 in that range, you're starting to get noticed at the national stage. And for college guys, it's even longer runway. Maybe they've been, 7 to 8 years where they've really been honed in. They've really been focused on this. And then this big moment in their life happens. And to this day, the draft is still one of the coolest sports moments I've had in my entire life. So rewarding yourself with some sort of purchase after it, I would actually encourage most guys to do that. The mistake that guys make, though, is they don't understand the two different categories. That one is a reward purchase because it happened one time. You're rewarding yourself for all the hard work, but that's not a lifestyle purchase. And the example I would use that is probably the most common is somebody goes out and buys $100,000+ car, or in today's world, maybe $150,000 car. So they go buy the new Range Rover. Great. You got a reward purchase. You rewarded yourself for all the hard work you put in. That does not mean that every 2 or 3 years we're going to go out and buy a new Range Rover. That would be a lifestyle purchase, and that would require a far different amount of money.
I want to get back to money, but something that just popped in my mind. So being from St. Louis, I have two questions. One of them is a simple one, and then the other one might be a little deeper. But the first question: growing up in St. Louis, would you describe St. Louis as a baseball town back then, and then even now?
So it's a baseball town in the sense that the Cardinals are here, and the Cardinals have some of the best fans in the world. They never boo. They always cheer. They always show up. Even if the team's not good, they're there. But in terms of it being a baseball town from an amateur perspective, I wouldn't describe it that way because when you think about Southern California, when you think about South Florida, when you think about Texas, you think about Georgia, some of the Carolinas, those are more amateur baseball hotbeds, so to speak. So in one sense, it's definitely a baseball town. Look, the Cardinals are here. huge fan base, and it is as loyal as you can possibly be. But on the flip side of that, it's not a true baseball town in the sense that like this is a hotbed for guys coming out and playing professional baseball.
So perfect, because that leads me to my next question. So within entrepreneurship, there's a lot of talk, and I've heard this on multiple podcasts. This idea of proximity. So essentially, hey, if you want to go out and build a startup, go out to the Bay Area, right, where the tech scene, Silicon Valley, all that good stuff. If you want to be in entertainment, if you want to do the whole Hollywood thing, LA is your place to be, and so on and so forth. There's like these hubs that enable proximity, right? You're surrounded by like-minded people. So I'm interested to hear that St. Louis isn't a huge hub for amateur baseball, and you brought up several hubs: South Florida, Southern California. So I guess I'm interested to hear what your perspective is on the importance of proximity, and if it really truly matters as much as maybe other people seem to think.
I don't think proximity matters as much in 2024 as it used to matter. But what does matter is the inputs that you take in and the perspective that you have. And the reason why I say that is because in 2024, we live in the age of the internet, right? So whether I live in St. Louis and you live in Southern California, or I live in St. Louis and you live across the world in England, we can all be connected on the internet. But I think it is really important to understand what are the inputs that I'm taking in, because ultimately those are going to lead oftentimes to the outputs that I'm putting out. And I see this a lot, whether it's entrepreneurship or whether it's young athletes. They've only been around their little bubble. And I think this is true for anybody. And they're the king of their little bubble, but they don't realize that their bubble is little and that there's a far larger bubble outside of what they're doing. And I think it's important for athletes and entrepreneurs to understand what that other bubble potentially looks like, and understanding that one of the biggest mistakes I see people make all the time is they take their foot off the gas and they think they've quote unquote made it. And I don't care what you're doing, whether it's business, whether it's sports, there's always somebody coming for the next opportunity. There's always the next version of you, the younger, hungrier version of you that's coming.
Yeah, I think Mark Cuban said it best. I think his quote was, "Work like there's somebody working 24 hours a day to take away what you have." And that really hit
I
home for
love
me,
that.
because I think it puts that into perspective. Exactly what you just said. I think it puts into perspective with, hey, there's always somebody else trying to compete with you. I guess on that topic of competition, what was it like competing at the highest level in baseball, and what were some of the things that you noticed that maybe other players were doing that you weren't doing? Maybe you come onto the Tigers and you're like, oh, like I didn't even think to do this. Like I can't believe this guy is paying this much attention, or doing this in such a detailed manner. What were some of those things that maybe caught you off guard, I guess you could say?
It's somewhat cliche to say, but I think when you get to that level, the level of talent between the majority of guys is pretty even. And what I'll say is there's probably 10% of guys on the top end that have another level of talent that the middle 80% of guys don't have, and there's guys on the bottom end, the bottom 10%, that don't have the level of ability that the middle 80% have. And ultimately what the separator is for the guys in the middle 80%, which is where I would categorize my talent level when I was playing, was oftentimes it was mindset, it was the momentum that they maybe had, it was a host of outside factors that led to their on the field performance. The thing that, and to talk a little bit about what we just touched on, this idea of work like somebody's chasing you. One of the things that always stood out to me was, so Max Scherzer was a teammate of mine, a former St. Louis guy and a friend. And one thing that always stood out to me about Max was every spring training, he would come in with the same mindset and the same intensity to get better. And this was true whether it was, I played with him when he was first cracking into the big leagues with Detroit, and I played with him when he was on, let's call it year 4 of a $200+ million contract with the Nationals. And he really had that same level of intensity in spring training as he did when he was first coming into the league. And I think that's a rarity, because oftentimes guys get established, they make some money, and maybe they kind of pull back. They let their foot off the gas, so to speak. But to be able to see a guy like that, a future Hall of Famer, really keep up the level of intensity was, I think, unique even in that world.
So where do you think this I guess this desire for self growth comes from, and is it maybe somehow tied to the inputs that you have? Something that you touched on earlier.
I think a lot of it comes from the what is the passion you have around the thing you're doing? Because even as I look out in the landscape today, I'll use baseball as an example. I think there's a lot of guys that play baseball today that play baseball because of all the extra factors that come with baseball: the fame, the money, the lifestyle, whatever it may be. But the love and the competing and the focus on the day to day, maybe they don't have the same desire to focus on those areas. When I think about the highest performers, they love the process. They love the process of getting better. Even the mundane, boring stuff that nobody's ever going to see them doing, but they almost crave that routine and crave that process to get better, knowing that yes, the results are going to follow, but they're so focused on the process that the rest of it just takes care of itself.
How do you think we scale that mindset? Because I think seemingly nowadays with TikTok, with Instagram, with all of this, social media, the internet we touched on earlier, it seems like everything that's promoted is this get rich, get famous quick lifestyle where it's one day you have nothing, the next day you have a Lamborghini and a beautiful home or whatever. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not sustainable, right? I mean, it, you've lived through it, you've experienced it. So how do we scale this mindset of, hey, listen, getting rich quick is not sustainable, nor is it realistic. Actually, what you have to do is become become enamored with the mundane tasks.
Yeah, it's interesting, even using the word scale there. I don't think you do scale it. And I don't think it does scale because
Mm.
if you look back over history, right, and if we use money as a barometer for success, everybody can use their own barometer, but I think the most common one from a financial perspective is like, how much monetary success do you have? If everybody had the same mindset to constantly get better and to constantly do the mundane work, nobody would technically be rich because everybody would have the same amount of money. Everybody would have a bunch of money, right? Or nobody would have any money because like there would be no outliers. So I think the reality is for there to be outliers, there's got to be people that are doing things that frankly don't scale with everybody else. Or in another way, they don't compute with the normal person. I mean, I read Elon Musk's biography and some of the stuff that he does to get to the level that he's at, it just does not compute even in my brain. And that's just another example of like a true outlier in every sense of the word. So, we say this in our business is like do things that don't scale. And I think scaling for success oftentimes is doing things that don't scale.
Yeah, I was immediately reminded of Paul Graham's essay, "Do Things That Don't Scale." I remember reading that, and I was like, I mean, it makes a ton of sense, and it's a lot of the things that we touched on, which is doing stuff that most people wouldn't think to do. And I remember reading or watching, how Bumble got started, and basically how they went to each individual sorority, right, and said, hey. Basically like, do you want to use this app? And, Bumble is an example. There's many examples like that, but stuff that maybe I wouldn't think to do, and a lot of it is, like we talked about, it's mundane, it's boring. You don't really see kind of the big flashy numbers, right? One sorority, I mean, I don't know, maybe it has 50 girls in there. I'm not familiar with sororities, but
Yeah.
um, you're only targeting a small group of people, but what you don't realize is kind of the effects that could have later on. So I think it's a fascinating topic, and I like your point about, well, maybe it shouldn't be something that most people do, right? Because then you wouldn't have those true outliers.
Yeah, 100%. I think I hadn't heard that example of Bumble, but I think oftentimes some of the best business examples in the world, they all did stuff that didn't scale. And then maybe after they've gained market share, after they've gained customer base, or after they've gained loyalty, then they started creating efficiencies. It's interesting that you say that because as I think about that, one of the things people talk about money is like automations. And what I tell
Mm.
people is like at the beginning, when you're first figuring out money, don't do automations because automations make you not think about anything you're doing. In fact, I would argue that like you should go back to if you wanted to really understand money as an 18-year-old, I'd say just spend money, just spend cash. Give yourself whatever, $200 every single week in cash. And when the money's gone, the money's gone. And have no automation. And that would teach you more about spending and saving money and the cost of a dollar than anything else.
It's a good point. Mike Trout. I believe that you have a story about Mike Trout and rooming with him that maybe taught you one or two things about life.
Yeah, so Mike Trout and I played high school baseball. We were draft class, same draft class in high school essentially. And in the summer before we got drafted, we played at essentially it was the Team USA trials for the 18 and under team. So they invited about 144 guys out there. And at the time, you had a roommate. So my roommate happened to be a guy named Mike Trout, who at the time nobody had heard of. And I remember him playing. I was like, this guy's really athletic, but he wasn't ranked real high in any of the rankings. We both ended up making essentially the first roster cut down, I think, to about 40 guys. And then they ultimately ended up taking about 25 guys on the main Team USA team. And Mike didn't make the team. So I made Team USA. Mike Trout didn't make Team USA. And now looking back, Mike's obviously a generational talent, like arguably maybe one of the top 5 baseball players of all time. And I think it's just such a fascinating concept about so many things. Like the fact that, they didn't choose the guy who literally is the best player in the past decade. That same guy didn't take that failure and mope about it, but he ended up, creating a ton of success around it. And ultimately, we talked about youth sports earlier, the fact that like, okay, man, maybe he wasn't, a generational player as a 17-year-old kid, but he's a generational player as a 30-year-old.
Yeah, I don't know how closely you follow the NFL, but Brock Purdy is another. I'm a huge 49ers fan. So, Brock Purdy is another example. Last pick of the draft.
Oh man. We have to
Oh
talk more
no.
about this.
Oh boy,
I
I
mean,
know.
I got a Detroit jersey in the background and anyways.
Well,
Continue on.
listen.
Brock Purdy, good story, man.
I had a feeling that you might be a Lions fan, playing for the Tigers, being in that city
I'm not
for.
really an NFL fan in general. I'm a fantasy football fan. But what I will say is I
Okay,
root for the storyline. And the Niners, they've been good. I kind of like the new guy in town, and Detroit has a special place in my heart. But
I get
man,
it.
Purdy, he came, man, strong performance. Strong.
Yeah, listen, I get it. I've been telling people that if I wasn't a Niners fan, I'd be rooting for the Lions for the same exact reasons. The storyline, that franchise has been, bad for 30 years, have seen no success. Listen, I get it. Like I said, if I was anything but a Niners fan, I'd be rooting for the Lions. But I mean, Brock Purdy. So last pick in the draft, wants to transfer to Alabama during his college career. Nick Saban straight up tells him, "Listen, your athleticism is average, your arm strength is average, your accuracy average. We don't want you." And now, MVP candidate this year. He's playing in the Super Bowl. He, in my opinion, led the team to a win last night against the Lions. Kind of ties in with the whole Mike Trout thing, where it's like
Yeah.
some people just have this appetite to deal with failure. So, to me, again, I don't compute that at all. I just don't get it, because I can't imagine being in that position, being told no so many times, and then just being like, you know what, I'm just going to keep going. I'm just, this is what I want to do. So I'm curious from your perspective, if you can help me understand, like, is it just that they have more grit than the normal person? Is it that passion that we touched on earlier that kind of fuels them and keeps them going? Like, what, from your perspective, what do you think contributes to their ability to just keep going when people tell them no?
I think it's a delusional level of self-belief. And when I say delusional, I mean that in the best possible sense. But it's a level of self-belief that's even greater than what your actual talent level is. Some of the greatest players I played with that didn't have the most talent but maximized their talent, they thought they were just better than they really were. And it's like this delusional level of self-belief where they have so much self-belief in their own ability to go out there and compete that it's almost a hard thing to teach. I think some guys just have that unique ability. And then the other thing that I would say is there are just certain guys that are in the right spot at the right time, and they started building momentum, and they took that momentum and they never let it stop. Because in professional sports, I think golf is the greatest example of this because it's such an individualized game, but golf is a game of momentum, right? Somebody wins 1 week and they haven't won for 2 years, and then the next 3 weeks they place in the top 10, right? It happens all the time. And then you don't hear about them for the next 12 months because they kind of lost the momentum. That same thing happens in any professional sports world. But as a quarterback in the NFL, like Brock Purdy as an example, he gained some momentum the previous year. He's continued on with that momentum, and I think he probably has a level of self-belief that, like, I can go out there and I can do this thing.
So I believe you had a tweet that kind of listed out some of the things that you learned while you were playing in the MLB, and one of them was this phrase, confidence is a choice. Explain how that maybe ties into this, delusional self-belief that you just touched on.
Well, look, it's a lot easier to be confident when everything around you is going great. If you're a pitcher and you go out there and you throw 7 shutout innings, or you're Brock Purdy and you throw a game with 3 touchdown passes, that next game, like, it's a lot easier to be confident. But the reality is, the separator is when Brock Purdy had a 4 interception game earlier this year. I think he did. How do you come back from that? And the reality is, when you walk into the locker room that day, whether it's a sports arena or whether you walk into a business setting, you have the ability to choose confidence. It's your decision. Now, it might be a lot harder when you just came off a 4 interception game, or you didn't close the big deal that you wanted to close. But at the end of the day, confidence is a choice, and it's completely inside of your control. Because when you think about what confidence really is it's your own mental headspace. It's all these outputs that are around you coming in and saying, okay, am I choosing to be confident or not? Because there's nothing that you can do. There's nobody telling you, like, nope, you know what, you can't be confident today. It's completely inside of these walls right here.
So what are some like techniques that you would recommend? Hey, let's do this right now. So like, myself, I'm doing this podcast, and before we started recording, I had a choice. I was like, I can either be confident or I could be not confident. Right. So if, let's say, the next time I go out to record an episode, I'm sitting there and I'm like, all right, I want to choose to be confident. What would you prescribe to help me choose that confidence?
The easiest thing is to come in prepared. I don't know about you, but I've come into certain situations in my life, and they've been relatively big moments, and I've been like, you know what? I don't think I'm prepared as I probably should be for this. I can remember doing a speaking engagement, and it was like 30 minutes before the speech. I didn't realize how many people were going to be there. I'm like, man, I did not prepare like I should have prepared, because I did not realize how many people were going to be there. And I was kind of scrambling, and it all ended up working out. But I got to be honest, like, I wasn't a 10 out of 10 confident walking on that stage. So I think first and foremost, the number one thing that you can do to that's inside of your control is to prepare. And then I also think the other thing is how you choose to carry yourself and how you choose to communicate with your words is completely inside of your control. And if you watch any great performer, whether they're an NFL quarterback, whether they're a comedian, whether they're a talk show host, whether they're an actor, they are presenting a level of confidence that every single person can present, right? It does not mean that internally they're feeling that same confidence, but they're projecting that confidence. And I think oftentimes constantly projecting whatever that is, if it's confidence in the situation, ultimately leads to you start believing it. When you start believing it, you start getting that delusional self-belief of like, no, I really am the person that I am saying I am every single time. And Alex Hormozi has this incredible quote about, you want to have an undeniable stack of proof that you are who you say you are. And I think ultimately, like, that's what this is, right? You prepare, you go out there, you project confidence, and you do that over and over and over and over again, and whatever you're doing. And all of a sudden it's almost impossible not to, because like, no, I got this thing.
So let me ask you, as a former, pitcher in the MLB, you're out there, you're on the mound, you're by yourself, you have nobody telling you, hey, Jacob, you got this, maybe before the game or after the game, but during the game, definitely not. You're out there by yourself. And maybe you threw a couple shaky pitches off to start, and you're like, oh man, I don't know if I'm feeling it today, but lead me through some of the mental hurdles that you had to go through standing out there by yourself. And the reason I ask is, I recently had Rajiv Ram on the show. He's former #1 doubles tennis player in the world. And tennis as a sport in its nature, if you're playing singles, is a very lonely sport. You're out there by yourself, and all you have is like you said, all you have is what's in your head, right? Between the walls of your head. And so being a doubles tennis player, it's a little bit different. You have a partner, so you have someone to talk to, but still it's a very lonely sport. So I'm interested to hear, as someone who played, in my opinion, a lonely position, what were some of the mental hurdles that you had to jump through when you were out there by yourself?
Yeah, there's not many worse feelings in the world than when you single-handedly load the bases, right? So maybe you walk 3 guys, or maybe you walk a guy and you just throw up 2 snowballs, and now all of a sudden it's bases loaded, and the defense didn't do anything to load those bases. You did everything, right? That's a lonely position. And maybe the 3-hole hitter's coming up, and you're just like, man, I'm not feeling it right now, but like I got to buckle down essentially. And everybody talks about when you're in this zone as an athlete, you're not really thinking, you're just kind of moving and going. And the one thing that I always felt like helped me was to always project externally, always focus on the external, don't focus on the internal. So an example would be, if I just walk 2 guys, instead of starting to think about what my mechanics would be, or where my leg needed to be, or where my arm slot needed to be, in reality, that didn't matter, right? It was going to be about me competing. So what could I do to get into a very aggressive state? And what I would always try to do is I would aim small, right? So I'm projecting out and I'm saying, I'm trying to throw this fastball at this lace of the catcher's glove, and I'm just going to give everything I can towards that. So everything I'm doing from a mental perspective, from a thought process perspective, is focused on what I want this result to look like. I'm going to nail this pitch, but everything's focused externally as opposed to focused internally. And that was something that always helped me. But it's a challenge, right? Like when you're out there and you are in that zone, you can literally remember every single pitch you threw. You can get done with the game and you don't remember anything about the stands, what anybody said, but you can remember, like, I threw that down and away slider. It was 2-1, and I struck him out on the 3-2 breaking ball. When you're not in that zone, you can hear the guy in the 3rd row chirping at you.
Yeah. I'm laughing because I love that you brought up this idea of the flow state. I was listening to Steph Curry talk about this a bit on JJ Redick's podcast, and basically saying how, listen, any shot that I've attempted in a game, I've practiced millions of times. Like, I've lost count how many times I've practiced that exact move or the exact shot. And he mentions the same thing when he's out there playing in the game. He's in this flow state and he's not thinking, he's just doing. And so to him, what might seem crazy to you or me, like, how did he pull that off? He's practiced a million times. And I had CJ Watson on the podcast who played with him, who played with Steph Curry his rookie year, and he said the same thing. That shot that Curry does, when he'll shoot a 3 and then he'll run back before seeing if it went in. He practiced that thousands of times in practice. Like, it wasn't like one game. He was like, let me let me try this out. He practiced it so many times that it eventually just became second nature. So I think that flow state that you just described and kind of being in the zone, it seems to be a common theme across all sports and all athletes.
Yeah, definitely. I think any athlete would tell you, like, when they get into that state, it's hard to even explain. I remember baseball players would always talk about, if I could go back to the day that I made my major league debut and how the level of focus I had. And really, it was just like they were just in such a flow state because, the adrenaline had taken over, and it was like, I'm going to focus on this one thing I'm doing, and I'm going to be so locked into it. But, much to your point, Nick, I think people see sometimes what athletes do. Patrick Mahomes is a great example. Like, he has all these completely off the cuff throws, and people are like, that's crazy. I can't believe he did that. But I can guarantee that he's practicing that. He's messing around with that in practice. He's training. He's moving his body in a way when he's training in the weight room to be able to make those throws. Like, he didn't just walk out there and start doing that.
Have you experienced this flow state? When you figure out a name for this whole, like, flow state thing, I feel like saying flow state over and over again is like it's a lot. This flow state phenomenon, that makes it more complicated. Have you experienced it outside of sports and maybe other aspects of your life?
When I first started in the business, whenever we'd have a big meeting, I used to get a little bit of nerves around it, and kind of that good nervous energy where I really wanted to be focused, and I came into it and I was focused. And I think in a sense, I've had that flow state doing that, but I also think the flow state for me has come whenever I've just cared the most about whatever the situation is, right? I mean, if you think about, if you had a life or death situation, right? And it was life or death that it was going to happen. Like, how focused would you be? You wouldn't know anything else that happened around you. And I think for me, it's been hard to find things that give me the same level of focus that, playing baseball in front of 40,000 people do. Like, I love golf, and I joke with people that I'm like, if I could focus for 4 hours playing golf, I'd be really good. But I can usually focus for about 2.5 hours. And then it's like, I'm just okay at golf.
Yeah. Um, I I guess my next point would be we talked about practice and about repetition. Um, is that just the key to success? Because I'm almost tempted to say that if you want to be really good at something, just do it over and over again. Like, don't think about anything else. Just keep doing it, and eventually you'll find yourself being a lot better at that one thing than you were some time ago. So, is it really just as simple as just doing it over and over again and just becoming better?
Yeah. Okay, sports is like this outlier example because you have to have some level of talent plus the focus plus the repetition to get to the highest level, right? Like, I'm not a good basketball player. No matter how many times I practice shooting 3-pointers, I'm not that athletic. I'm not going to be like throwing dunks over guys. Like, I would not, I have no chance of playing in the NBA, no matter how many times I practice. But in the real world, whatever you want to do, I think you can practice it enough times that you can be good at it. And one of the biggest mistakes people make in life, like, if you have any takeaway from this podcast, listen to this. The biggest mistake that people make in life is they don't focus on one thing for long enough. They do it for what they think is a long time, a couple of years, 2-3 years, and they're like, I'm not really seeing the progress. Or maybe they do it for 6 months and they're like, I'm not seeing the progress. And the reality is, then they look up at somebody that's successful, quote unquote, in their eyes, whatever that means for them. And that guy's been doing it for 20 years, the same thing for 20 years. And you're like, well, why am I not successful at it? Well, you've only been doing it for 3. And I think you could literally be successful at almost anything in life, outside of like some super outlier examples like Jacob Turner playing in the NBA. If you just focused on one thing for a really long period of time, but we're humans, we get distracted, we get discouraged, and we tangent to something else. I think one of the best examples is go to like whatever your most popular YouTuber that you like to watch is, and go back to his oldest videos and watch their first couple of videos, right? It's this great example of like, oh, wow, he wasn't that great on camera when he first started, but he's done thousands of videos now and he looks like a pro. I mean, that's like the epitome as somebody that's doing more and more video stuff. I've gone back and done that. It's been just fascinating for me to see even some of the best YouTubers in the world when they first started doing it. It's like, well, they weren't as good, but now they've been doing it 10 plus years.
I love that example because I do the same thing with podcasters. I'll go back and listen to their first interviews, and I can't wait one day to go back and look at some of my first interviews. Maybe I'll go back and give this one a
Yeah.
listen. 3, 5, 10 years down the road and be like, man, either I'll say I sucked or wow, I've really come a long way.
Well,
um,
I'll throw myself under the bus here. So I write a lot of content online, and I love writing, and I've always thought I'm a pretty decent writer. But essentially, the way that I do this is like I will save every post that I make, and at some point, I'll go back and I'll look at some of the best posts, and I'll see like, okay, like that was a really good idea. How could I potentially reuse that idea? And without fail, every single time that I go back and look at a post I did a year ago, I'm like, oh man, like I can make this so much better. But at the
yeah,
time, I was like, nope, this is it. Like, I nailed this post. This is the exact copywriting that you would want. And now a year later, I'm like, man, that kind of stinks. Like, oh, I should totally change that word. And like, why did I add that line? That doesn't add any value for the reader. And so it's fascinating for me to even go back and look at that.
yeah. I'll not to harp on it for too long, but I'll look back at some of my first Instagram reels or TikToks that I posted. I'm like, wow, that's embarrassing. Like, well, like in the moment, I was like, dude, this is so good. This is going to be amazing. But now
Yeah.
I look back on it, I'm like, why did I ask that question? Why did I say that this way?
Yeah.
What am I doing? What was I doing? But I think that's good. I think it's a sign of growth, which is exciting. So I think the takeaway is that, we should be excited because we're growing and we're becoming better at what we're doing. Um, Really quick, I want to jump back to the discussion that we had with doing something for a long time and how it leads to success. I want to give you a counterpoint, and I'm interested to hear your take on it. So you mentioned basketball and you said, listen, Jacob Turner could practice every day for the next 10 years. He would not be able to dunk over people. Um, I'm curious when it comes to, let's take podcasting for as an example. We're on a podcast right now. Let's say you do podcasting for a couple years and you're like, oh man, like I don't, this might not be it. I might not be good. But Jacob told me that I should stick with it and keep going, and soon enough I'll be successful. But we also know that that's not always the case, right? There's people who maybe have stuck with it that didn't end up reaching their goals. So all in all, to say, what's that fine line between knowing when to quit something, and then just sticking with it and trusting the process, and keeping that self-belief that we touched on earlier?
That's a great point. I think that inflection is something that everybody will naturally come to on their own, in my opinion. But ultimately, it starts with like, what are you trying to accomplish with what you're doing? If your goal as a podcaster is to constantly be able to get better guests, because your thesis says, if I get better guests over time, my podcast is going to grow. If my podcast grows, I'm going to be able to monetize it. If I'm able to monetize it, I'm going to be able to make this a full-time thing. If I can make this a full-time thing, I can get closer to what Joe Rogan does, right? And if you're 3 years in and you're like, I'm not getting any bigger guests, either you need to change what you're doing or you need to pivot to something else. Because the first step in you getting closer to Joe Rogan and monetizing this thing and making it full time was you getting bigger guests. And if you're 3 years in and you're not getting any bigger guests, I would say, maybe that isn't the right platform for you. And the example I would use about basketball is, if I went out and started shooting hoops and in 3 years I wasn't playing professional basketball in some league, whether it's overseas or in the G League, I'd say, like, I'm not getting any younger. Like, maybe I should be pivoting to something else. But I think we need to have a stair step approach, so to speak, to what we're doing. If I look at my business that I have today and I say, I want it to be like XYZ business that's, 100 times the size of mine. And I said, well, I've been doing it 3 years and I'm not having those results, so it's not a success. But the reality is, well, let's backtrack. Let's see what they were doing after 3 years and see kind of how do we stack up? And what is my thesis for growing it? Is my thesis for growing it, has it changed at all? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? So it's a much more complex answer than I think just a yes or no. But oftentimes when I hear people say that, I think it requires another level of question and a little bit deeper, second level thinking of like, what am I really trying to get to? And am I getting closer to that first stair step?
So is your recommendation then, for people who might be listening, is it to have predefined goals? Is it, because that's what it kind of sounds like to me, right? Like,
Yeah.
again, staying on the podcasting thing, it's like, hey, where do you want to be? What would be success in your eyes, right? Like you said, in 3 years, if I'm getting bigger guests, all right, let's keep going, because we're getting somewhere. So is it just making those goals and then setting a timeline for them? Is that what, I guess, what your recommendation boils down to?
So I've seen people say like, oh, don't set goals, or people say set goals. Like, I personally think you should set goals. Like, I think you should have a vision board of like, what am I trying to accomplish? I know for me, every good thing that's happened in my life has started with the end in mind. And this is probably just part of kind of how my brain works too, is like, if I start with the end in mind, then I can reverse engineer the steps I need to take to get to the end. So for me, like, I have 1 year goals for me personally and for my business, but they started with the end in mind and they said, I want to get to XYZ goal. But in order for me to get there, this is what I need to do each quarter. And this is what I need to do each month. And this is what I need to do today. And I think it's the same thing for things I want to accomplish 10 or 20 years down the road. That works for me. I think you got to find something that works for you. But for me, starting with the end in mind and having some sort of goal setting that comes down to like, what is the action that I can take today to get closer to that goal?
I'm curious, when you first entered the league, what was your end goal? And from your own experience, was there a point in time where you sat down with yourself and you said, listen, Jacob, we had this end goal, of being in the MLB, maybe we wanted to enter free agency, right? The 6 year service time. And we're not getting there. So maybe it's time to hang this up.
Yeah, for me, when I first got drafted, my first goal was to get to the big leagues. When I first got to the big leagues, my first goal was like, become a established player where like every year, we're one of the guys. And then it's like, let's get to free agency. Let's win a World Series. Let's become a Hall of Famer. I think those are like the natural progressions as an athlete, and especially as a baseball player. For me, there came a time probably 6 to 7 years into my career where I really had to get real with myself about like, this is not how I saw it going. And it took a long time for me to even say those words out loud, because it was almost like I was living in denial of the fact that like it wasn't going the way that I thought it was going to go. Like everybody else around me could see that, but me personally, I'm like, I would never say those words. My last year when I played in 2019, when I decided to stop playing, the reason why I decided to stop playing was twofold. One, I had enough data on me as a pitcher, like on my talent level and the things I could do with a baseball, to say, unless something drastically changed, and unless somebody found essentially like lightning in the bottle that of something that a rock that I had not uncovered yet, nothing was really going to change drastically on the field. Now, look, things could align and I could have a great season, but I wasn't going to go out the next year and all of a sudden start striking out 15 guys a game. That just wasn't where my ability level was. It wasn't what God had gifted me the ability to do with the baseball. And then in turn, I was able to look at it and say, okay, if my end outcome isn't as good as what I wanted it to be in the first place, do I still love the process enough to compete at whatever level I can compete at? And for me, I didn't love the process enough. And if I didn't love the process enough, there was no way that I was going to be able to go out there and compete at that level and have success. And that's ultimately what led me to have the decision of like, it's time to move on to something else.
Is there uh, is there something specific that you can point to and say this is where things kind of went wrong with my career in the MLB? Like, or is there a specific moment in time or something where it's like, listen, things were going well, this happened, things kind of fell off the rails? Or do you think it was just the natural progression, kind of what you're alluding to, of kind of losing that passion over time?
I think it was a little bit twofold. When I first got drafted, we did not have all the data that they do now. And if we would have had the data that we do now, I don't know if I would have got drafted as high as I did, because there were certain things in terms of like spin rate and pitch shapes and how my body moved that were suboptimal. But at the time, we didn't have some of that data. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is to go back to the idea of like, why am I so passionate about telling guys to keep their foot on the gas? In a sense, I worked really hard. And one thing that I always said in my career was like, I just want to work as hard as I can and I'll let the chips fall where they may. Like, if I do that, I can play with no regrets. And I can honestly say I did that. But at the same time, I do think I had this mindset early on because I got to the big leagues so fast and I had a lot of success at a really young age that I was kind of like, my first time I failed, I remember thinking, well, like at some point this is going to click and this will happen. And it wasn't that I wasn't working hard, but I think my dial could have been turned up a little bit more in terms of the intensity that I was going at, because the intensity that I was going at as a 27-year-old in AAA after I'd been sent down a couple times was, if I get one more chance, I need to make sure I capitalize on this. I didn't have that same intensity as a 20-year-old because I was like, I'm going to work hard and it'll work out. And if it doesn't work out this time, I'll get another opportunity. But as a 27-year-old in AAA, I'm like, this might be it. Like, I need to make sure that my foot is on the gas and I am, essentially going for the par 5 and 2 if I get the opportunity.
So it sounds like maybe being a first round draft pick and having a little more leeway might have been both a blessing and a curse early on in your career.
I would say so. I think if I had the same perspective now as a 20-year-old, my dial would have been turned up a little bit more in terms of just the level of intensity I would have had, knowing like how quickly it can all go away. But it's really hard to understand that as a 20-year-old kid that hasn't ever really experienced like true failure.
Right. And I mean, especially coming into the league, making millions right off the bat, I'm sure that was also a shock. We touched on it earlier, this episode about, now you have millions in the bank account. What do I do with this money? Where do I go? I want to touch on, so two more topics and then we'll wrap up this episode. One, so you put out this tweet, and again, it was kind of just a list of things that you learned from your time in the league. And I want to read you a couple of these things that stood out to me and then get your reaction to it. We kind of do these like rapid fire. So one of them was need to know only. You said professional sports equals business first. What does that mean?
There's a lot of people in your life that will act like they're your buddies, but all they really want to do is get information. And professional sports is business, right? I went to the winter meetings this year, and you see the business behind the guys on the field. But a lot of times, as the player, you don't realize how big the business is that's running behind the scenes behind you.
You mentioned the bus, and I believe you put out a tweet. I think it was also something that your father taught you, which was be careful who you let onto your bus, something along those lines. What can you explain really quick what that analogy means?
Yeah, so my dad gave me a little toy bus when I first got drafted, and he just shared the story with me that, Jacob, as you continue to have more success in your life, there's going to be more people that want to be on your bus, but just understand that you want to make sure that they're on the bus for you. And I think that's always resonated with me because I had a lot of success early on. There was a ton of people on the bus. Then all of a sudden I wasn't having success, and some of those people that I thought were on the bus, when I would call them, like, they weren't picking up the phone, they weren't calling me back. So I think it's really important for people to understand, whether you're an athlete or whether you're in business, any point in life, like, make sure you have people on the bus that are there for you. I mean, one of my buddies talks about this idea of like darkest hour friends. This idea that like you want people that are going to be there when things are the worst, not just when things are the best.
Next topic. The red carpet lasts 2 days.
Yeah, so I got drafted as an 18-year-old kid, signed for all this money, get interviewed by all the media in Detroit. I go to the stadium, they show my mug on the jumbotron. I get a walk around the clubhouse. I feel like I'm a big leaguer. And 48 hours later, I'm in Lakeland, Florida, which is the middle of Central Florida, and I'm shagging balls in 100-degree heat just as another minor league guy. So I went from being a nobody to feeling like I was a big leaguer for 48 hours to realizing that I had a lot of work to do to actually become a big leaguer.
I'm in Orlando, and I am familiar with both Lakeland and the Florida summer heat, so I
Oh, there you
can
go.
I can resonate with that. All right, there are no emotions, and let me read you something that you said. So you said there are no emotions, and then you followed that up by saying, "Imagine doing your job only to hear your boss trying to find a replacement. My no emotion night came after struggling against my hometown team, the St. Louis Cardinals. A few hours after celebrating my family being there, I was sent down to AAA."
One of the loneliest times of my life was driving back to my house in St. Louis after getting told I was going to AAA. It was this really weird feeling. I can like vividly remember being in the car and just feeling like I was alone in the entire world. Look, sports is a business, and the reality is, like, you get paid a lot of money to do a job that everybody would want to do. So let me just preface it by saying that I wasn't doing that job, and they had to find somebody else that could do it. And it just happened to be that we were in St. Louis, in my hometown, and I laid a stinker, and they let me know. So that was a unique time in my career, but I think it just taught me that, look, like, there's a million great people out there. The people that sent me down that day are great human beings, but they had a job to do too, and I wasn't holding up my end of the bargain.
Yeah, like you said, sports is a business. When you boil it down, it's a numbers game. And like you said, I mean, it's the same thing with, take your 9 to 5, right? If you're not performing up to the standards of your boss, if you're not meeting your deliverables, guess what? There's somebody else that is willing and able to come in. And it goes back to the Mark Cuban quote, what we touched on earlier, right? Work like there's somebody working 24 hours to take all of it away from you. And that's why I love that quote so much, because it's so applicable to literally anything you do: podcasting, sports, whatever, moment wealth, whatever you want to do. It's applicable to that scenario. So that's why I kind of, I keep that quote handy, and I kind of remind myself, from time to time, like, listen, there might be another Nick out there who wants to interview Jacob Turner, but you know what? Damn it, I want my interview to be better.
Yeah,
So,
right.
All right, well, let's wrap this up, Jacob, with talking a little bit about moment wealth and what you're trying to accomplish there. I want to read a stat to you and get your reaction to it. So The average salary in the four major sports is $4.5 million. Yet more than 70% of athletes go broke within 3 years of retirement. That blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. Why do you think so many athletes go broke so quickly?
It's a good tweet, by the way. If nobody's tweeted that yet, somebody should tweet that. But I think it's a couple things. One, let me preface it by saying the numbers can be a little bit misleading because while the average salary is around $4.5 million, the large percentage of guys will never make $4.5 million in a given year. If you look at the NFL, the average career lasts 3 years or less. Those guys are generally making league minimum. If you look at Major League Baseball, the average salary is $5 million, but the reality is most of the guys are on league minimum or close to that. So there's a lot of guys that don't make tens of millions of dollars in the game. But really the bigger issue lies in the fact that guys build out a lifestyle that's a little bit unsustainable. They focus on saving a good amount of money when they're playing. And if I use an example, let's say a guy's making $10 million and he saves $2 million a year. Sounds like a ton of money that he's saving, and it is. But the reality is that means he's spending the other $3 million after taxes, right? 5 is going to go to taxes. He's spending 3, saving 2. Well, you can't keep living a $3 million lifestyle by saving $2 million a year for 3 to 4 years, right? A $6 to $10 million nest egg is not going to support a $3 million lifestyle. So oftentimes the biggest issue that I see is guys just build lifestyles that are completely unsustainable. And when they get done, they're, for a multitude of reasons, they don't want to go back in lifestyle. It's very hard to go back in lifestyle. So that's why I always encourage guys, like, build it slowly over time. Focus on what you're doing on the field. The big purchases, let's do them very slowly and let's be very methodical and think through them before we go out and we buy $1 million homes.
What's your advice for athletes post-retirement? I think you had mentioned in a separate podcast that your parents placed a huge emphasis on you finishing college and getting that degree. I guess what's your advice to athletes post-retirement and how they navigate the real world after they get out of whatever sport that they were playing?
Yeah, my advice is that you should focus on doing everything you can possibly do to open as many doors as possible. And that starts with when you're playing. One of the biggest mistakes I made when I was playing was not having a small sliver of my focus on the fact that I was around all these really successful people and there was all these doors open to me as a professional athlete. And frankly, I didn't walk through many of them while I was playing. But I would say for any athlete, you want to make sure you try to open as many doors as possible. It's one of the reasons why I went back and I got my degree, because the reality is whether I had learned a lot going through that process or not, it kept all the doors open. You want to make sure that you're not closing any doors on yourself. But ultimately, a lot of times for athletes, that requires you really humbling yourself when you get done and saying, what are the steps that I need to do? Like, it doesn't matter that you're a professional athlete. Nobody cares. You're a retired athlete. They want to know what you can do for them now.
Let's bring this full circle. So you're the co-founder of Moment Wealth, which I might have mentioned earlier on, and your Twitter page for Moment Wealth says that you help athletes and entrepreneurs build and protect wealth. Beyond that, I want to know what is your personal end goal for Moment Wealth?
Yeah, I think my goal for the business is that we build a firm that I would be proud to sit on the other side of the table as a client. That's been my mission since day one, is that we build a firm that I would be proud if I was sitting on the other side of the table as a client. So, I don't have grandiose visions on making a ton of money or building the business to a certain size. I really want to have a solution for athletes and entrepreneurs, for people that are navigating a lot of the same complexities that I navigated. I want to have solutions for them to have success. Like, I know the sacrifices that I made to earn the money that I earned in baseball. I know how hard it was. And I want to make sure that there's a solution out there for them, that they can talk to people that have been in their shoes, that they can talk to people and they can have real honest conversations about, like, what are they trying to accomplish? And do they want to keep going on the path they're on?
Love it. Jacob, there was I believe a quote of yours that said that the best gift that your father gave you was the gift of being present and being there for your travel baseball games and being there on the weekend and supporting you. Now, as you go through your own, journey as a parent, you have 4 young ones. You have a lot going on. You got Moment Wealth. You're creating content on X, on Instagram. I'm sure you got other things going on as well that might not be public. When you think about balancing time between all of this, let's call it career stuff, and then being there for your kids, how much do you think about that quote from your father?
Yeah, it's really important. Look, I will never do anything in my business that has negative ramifications on my family. My family comes first. And, this weekend, my son and I went to a hockey tournament 4 hours away, and it was great. And we got to spend time together. And like, those are the memories that I want. Um, Making the extra dollar in our business is not important to me. I want to focus on the things that matter to me and will matter long term. And even for me in my business, right? Like the things that matter inside the business is the relationships we have with clients, is letting them know that we're going to be on their bus, whether they have the success they want to have or they fall somewhere in between or they fail. That knowing that, like, hey, if they choose to work with us, like we're going to be there. Like we're there for the long haul, guys. So yeah, my dad had a profound impact on my life. And to your point, Nick, like the presence that we have in people's lives is the most important thing. And the one thing that I'll leave people with in terms of that is people always talk about work-life balance. And what I want to stress about work-life balance is it's not, if you have whatever it is, 16 waking hours in a day, it's not spending 8 hours working and spending 8 hours at home, and that's work-life balance. Work-life balance is being hyper focused on whatever you're doing and being very intentional about being present in the moment that you're in. And that might mean an hour that you have with your kids at night. That might mean 2 hours with a client you have. That might mean an hour on a podcast, but being really present with what you're doing in that moment.
That's wonderful advice, and something that I think a lot of people can take home, and it's something that resonates with me deeply because it's something that I'm trying to work on more as I kind of go along my journey is being more present. Because you are right, a lot of the experiences that we have with our family, with our loved ones, with our friends, people who mean something to us, um, unfortunately they seem to be few and far between. And so just really being present in those moments that you get, I'll always remember, I go home for Christmas every year, and my parents live out in the Bay Area. I get to spend a couple weeks with them, with our English bulldog, and I swear those are some of like the best memories that I have, just getting to spend time with them and our dog, and just being present in that moment and appreciating it for what it is. So I love that advice, and I hope that people listening to this take that and try to apply it to their own lives. And one thing that I found, that I've been doing is whenever you're in that moment, tell yourself, be present, and it sounds dumb, but it works for me at least. And, you have to constantly remind yourself until it becomes a habit. Constantly tell yourself, be present. All right, you're here right now. Let's enjoy this. Don't think about what's happening tomorrow. Don't think about, what you have to do later on tonight. Just be here for this moment. And I think that is fantastic advice. I guess I have two more questions. I kind of lied to you. I said I had like two more questions for you, and now we're like 2 questions later, and I have two more. So I promise these are the last two. One of them is a question, and then one of them is something that we do on every episode. So this is kind of a fun one. You played for Detroit, Miami, Chicago, Washington. What was your favorite city, and why was it Miami?
Chicago. And that's
Chicago,
coming from
interesting.
a guy that was born and raised in St. Louis, and people in St. Louis have this vendetta against people in Chicago. But the reality is, Chicago is a great city. So all the people out there from St. Louis, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry, but Chicago's a great city.
Why is it great?
Dude, it just has everything. Like anything that
Yeah.
you want to do, it has, but it's also not New York City or not LA where you feel overwhelmed, in my opinion.
Who had the best fan base? This is going to be controversial.
Oh, it's got to be the Cubs. And the reason why is because I was there when we were terrible and we were still selling out that place. So shout out to the Cubs fans, man. They're loyal. They are loyal.
Yeah. I have to ask you about Miami because I have a lot of friends from Miami, and a couple of them might listen to this episode. So experience playing for the Marlins. Rate it 1 through
Mm,
10.
it's a it's a loaded question, and
Yeah.
I'm going to use my media training and not answer that question directly. But there was pros and cons, baby. It was an interesting time when I was there. They had built a new stadium, but at the same time, they were going through this massive transition. The year I got there, they were essentially dumping all the high priced players. There was some uproar in the front office, so there was pros and cons.
Listen, the friends I have in my life are loyal to the Marlins, and they have not had a ton of success
Mm.
as of late, but they are loyal fans. So I'll be the first one to tell you that there are loyal Marlins fans. They do exist out there.
I know they're out there. They gave me a hard time when I wasn't playing well there, so I know they're there. But yeah, no, it's an interesting city. Miami. My wife and I bought our first place in Miami, and we lived there for 3 years. So it's got a special place in my heart too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Jacob. Let's end this podcast the way that we end every podcast here on the Victory Degree. So I ask every guest to leave a piece of advice for the following guest, but the catch is that they don't know who the next guest is going to be. It's a complete stranger to them. So our last guest was Dr. Jesse Morse. So he is a sports doctor, I guess you could say. He's actually based out in Miami. He deals with a lot of athletes. He's prominent on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. And his advice was regarding your health: be proactive, not reactive. Don't wait for something to break before you fix it. Anticipate and try to get ahead of things. It's a lot easier to fix a minor issue than it is a moderate to severe issue. So, two parts here. One, what's your reaction to that? And two, what is your advice for our next guest?
Well, I'm currently reading Peter Attia's book on longevity and health, and it's all about being proactive with your health, which I'm a huge believer in, and probably something that outside of helping athletes with their money, I'm most passionate about. So I love that advice. Couldn't agree with him more. The advice I would give to the next guest is to be present. We talked about this at the end, and I think it's something that in the age that we live in with computers and screens and cell phones and everything at the touch of our fingertips, being present in the moment and soaking in those little moments of life is what really matters.
Love it. By the way, if you don't follow Dr. Jesse on X, highly recommend. He tweets a ton, and he'll put out, whatever a player's injury is, he'll give you a breakdown of what it is. He's a fantastic follow. I'm not obviously not affiliated or
No,
anything, but I
interesting.
just think he's
I'll
fantastic
check them
content.
out.
Yeah. And he has a thing, it's called the Fantasy Doctors, basically like a website, and they post Twitter content as well, basically again breaking down, hey, Isaiah Pacheco has this injury on
Okay,
his toe.
I've seen that. I've seen the fantasy guy stuff. If it's the same guy, there's like one. I'm a big fantasy guy, so
Yeah.
I'm checking that Sunday morning, like 10 o'clock, making sure my guys are healthy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, Jacob, this has been fun. This has been a fantastic conversation. I have enjoyed every single minute of it. I tried my best to stay present. I think we're gaining some ground on this whole thing. So can't thank you enough for coming on today and sharing your insights and advice. I had a fantastic time.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate you having me on.
All right, till next time.